Okay, we're in Galatians chapter 5. We left off in verse 6 last week, so we'll pick up in verse 7. I guess that's a good place to start. After 6 is 7. So that's where we'll try to start. But let's go back and read. Let's just read verses 1 through 12. We'll try to get down to verse 12 today. So it says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand therefore and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit by faith we ourselves eagerly await for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love counts for anything. You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves." Okay, so last time in verses 2 through 5, we were looking at consequences of accepting circumcision as the means of obtaining your salvation or keeping your salvation. And so in verse 2, let's just go through those consequences right quick before we get into verse 7. In verse 2, we learn that Christ is no benefit to us if our works, specifically circumcision in the case of the Galatians, save us or keep us secure in salvation. In verse 3, Paul reiterates the fact that if we attach circumcision to salvation, then we are obligated to keep the whole law, all of it. And then another consequence in verse 4 is that we're severed from Christ. We've fallen away from grace. So in other words, we're not drawing closer to Christ. We're running in the opposite direction. So there's no growth, there's no maturity for this type of person, if he's a genuine believer, and a lot of them would have been. He needs to come back to his senses, this person does, and grow in maturity in the Word of God. He needs to walk in the Spirit, as we'll see as we keep going into chapter 5. Because the famous fruit of the Spirit is in this chapter. So this person needs to walk in the Spirit and not depend on his flesh. And so now, as we come to verses 7 through 12, we're going to look at some characteristics of false teachers that we need to be aware of. So last week we looked at consequences of accepting circumcision or a works-based salvation, if you will. And this week we're going to look at some characteristics of false teachers that we need to be on the lookout for. But I thought about this quote this week to get us into this. Alexander Hamilton is attributed with this quote: "Those who stand for nothing will fall for anything." Those who stand for nothing will fall for anything. And so we've got to stand on the Word of God, right? Because if we don't, we can fall for anything. So we shouldn't assume things. We've got to know the truth, and we've got to study the Scriptures and know what we're talking about, right? So let's get into this, and starting in verse 7, we'll look at some of these characteristics of false teachers. So Paul begins this way. He says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" So that's the first characteristic we see right there. False doctrine or false teachers hinder the truth. So there's characteristic number 1 that we can point out. They hinder the truth. And he says, "You were running well." So apparently, while Paul was with these believers, they had no trouble living their Christian lives by faith like they should be. But at some point, and it doesn't seem to be very long after Paul left, they were listening to false teachers. And we can see that if we go all the way back to chapter 1. You don't have to flip there, I'll read it for you. But if we go all the way back to chapter 1, and Paul's first statements in this book, this is what he says in verses 6 and 7. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So it must not have taken very long, according to Paul's own words right there at the beginning of the book, that they were running well. And so we have a race metaphor here, don't we? And this is not the first time Paul's used this type of metaphor, even in Galatians, and we know he used it in other places as well. But let's look at the other time in Galatians that he used this same type of metaphor of running a race. It was in Galatians 2:2 when he was talking about going to Jerusalem, which you can read about it also in Acts chapter 15. He said, I went up to Jerusalem because of a revelation and set before them, that would have been the apostles, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had run in vain. So there's the same type of comparison there. In 1 Corinthians, he uses it as well. 1 Corinthians 9:24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? Unless today, everybody's supposed to get a trophy. It's not always been like that. So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So the comparison of an endurance athlete to our Christian walk is a good comparison. It's a great comparison, actually, because the Christian life is one of endurance. It's not a sprint. Have you ever watched the Olympics? The sprinters, their events are over within a matter of seconds. But the marathon runner, he's got to go a long way. That marathon runner or some of those swimming events or the cycling events, that is absolute and a test of your endurance. And so the Christian has to persevere. And so when you're in an endurance event, there's always some point in the race where you go through a tough spot. And you have to figure out how you're going to persevere. You'll start out feeling great, and I know this from experience. You start out from feeling great, and you have to be careful not to be overzealous at the beginning. Because if you don't fuel correctly, you can bonk is what we call it. You can bonk and your energy level just crashes. Which means you lose a lot of your concentration. You don't have your senses. You can get off course. You can make the wrong turn. You can crash. There's a lot of things that happen when you get in to that frame of mind. And so I had to learn that the first time that I ever did an endurance event like that, which on a bicycle is 100 miles or more. That's the equivalent to a marathon on a bike. It's 100 miles or more. And the first time I ever did that, I learned very quickly that you're going to go through a point to where you feel terrible. And mentally you just want to check out. Like I'm done with this. And it took me a few times to figure out where that point was. And for me, it was about 65 miles. And so the more that I did, I learned, okay, when I get to that point in the event, that's where I've got to be mentally tough. And so I would try to prepare myself to get to that point. Make sure I would eat enough, drink enough, pace myself correctly, not just go crazy at the beginning. And one particular event I was doing, I got on the front, because the people on the front race it, so I got on the front. And so there's about 40 of us to start with together, in a pack. And we're going down this road, and I was looking down the speed. We were going about 28 to 30 miles an hour, just screaming down the road. And this guy in front of me, because we ride in a pace line, kind of like NASCAR. The guy in front of me, he kept doing this to see who was on the front, like it wasn't fast enough. And he kept looking to see who was on the front, like go faster. And I'm looking down and I'm thinking, this is fast enough. We've got over 100 miles of this. And so I knew right then, I said, this guy's not going to make it. He's not going to stay in this group. Sure enough, about 35 miles in, I never saw that guy. He was gone. Because it's not a sprint. It's endurance, and you persevere and you go through that mental anguish of it. And that's the same way with our Christian walk. We go through periods, man, we feel great, don't we? Every week we come to church, it just seems like everything's going good. We're reading like we should be and all this kind of stuff, but then something happens, and you've got to learn to persevere. You have to learn to persevere in a Christian life. That's very important. And so our fuel is the Word of God. That's our fuel. It's not emotionalism. That's not our fuel. That might win you a sprint, so to speak. But it is not going to win you a marathon by any means. And so we're not going to run well without the proper fuel. Without the proper fuel. We've got to take that in. And he says, who hindered you from obeying the truth? You're running well, so who hindered you from obeying the truth? Now, he's not asking for the identity of a particular false teacher. The question's rhetorical. He's basically asked the same thing back in chapter 3, verse 1, where he said, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? So he's basically asking, well, who do you think these people are? They're not apostles. Who hindered you? It wasn't us. That's kind of what he's saying. And he's saying their purpose was not to lead the Galatians in the truth. That wasn't these people's purpose. Their purpose was to hinder them for their own selfish gain. And Paul had actually already said this back in chapter 4, verse 17. They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that you may make much of them. And see, we can see that today with what we would call false teachers, don't we? It's all about them. The $5,000 suits, the airplanes, the mansions, this kind of thing. It's all about them. And so obeying the truth, that has to be a reference to the true gospel, correct? The gospel of justification by faith. Now, the problem of legalism, it didn't just stop after this, did it? In the first century? Was Judaism the only form of legalism and it just stopped after all of that? Of course not. It's been a problem for 2,000 years and it'll continue to be a problem. But why is that? Why will it always be a problem? Because that's the way of the flesh. The flesh wants to live for its own gratification and under its own power. And so it's always going to be a problem. Peter tells us, 2 Peter chapter 2, famous chapter about false teachers. But false teachers also rose among the people, talking about Israel, just as there will be false teachers among you in the church who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality. Now, why will they do that? Because it's gratifying for the flesh, isn't it? And because of them, the way of the truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. So, an obvious characteristic of false teachers is that they hinder the truth. Now, another characteristic would be that they're not of God. That should be an obvious one. But that's what he says in verse 8. This persuasion is not from him who calls you. Now, let's look at that word persuasion there. From the Greek text. Now, before I get into that definition, normally if I said I were going to persuade you, and this is a common type paper that I have my students write all the time. Argumentative papers, persuasive papers, whatever term you want to attach to it. And the persuasion could be good or bad. We could persuade a lot of things. But this particular word here, from the Greek text, it means deceptive persuasion. So there's nothing good. This word does not have a good connotation. Its definition is bad. Okay? So it means deceptive persuasion. So you can't use this word in a positive context. And then we see from him who calls you. So this deceptive persuasion is not from him who calls you. Now this is obviously the effectual call of God, isn't it? The effectual call of God is what he's talking about. And he alone is responsible for the call of salvation. Now here was something else in the Greek text that I noticed this week in studying. The Greek text actually has a definite article in this verse. Now, let me just put that in plain, I was starting to say plain English, but that's the only thing I know is plain English. So there are 3 articles in the English language. 3 article adjectives. There's only 3. A, and the. Now that's not hard to understand, is it? A, and the. A and are used to refer to nothing specific. So I could say a man walked down the street. That could be anybody, right? Nobody specific. The is the definite article. So it always means something specific. So when you use the word the, it is always specific. The man walked down the street. Well, that's one particular man, not a man walked down the street. See the difference? Okay, well in the text here, in the Greek, there's a definite article. So you could say it this way. This deceptive persuasion is not from the caller. This deceptive persuasion is not from the one who calls, or you could just say the caller. And we know who that is, right? The one who calls, not a one who calls, or a caller, the caller. So when you see definite articles, that is always something specific. So legalism is not from God. It's not a part of His plan. And any teaching that says that God's plan of salvation can be supplemented with works of man is not from the caller. Obvious. So he goes on. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Okay, so let's look at these characteristics so far. So false teachers hinder the truth in verse 7. They are not of God in verse 8. That's obvious. And here we learn that false teachers contaminate the church. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Now that's an expression. It was used by the Jews and some other Middle Eastern cultures as well to describe something having great influence. Now, and the leaven represents permeating power or strong influence over, and the influence can be good or bad in the expression. It does not have to be bad. It can be good or bad. Now, when I preached this parable a few months ago, we discussed this a little more in depth, what leaven is and how the Jews, they would save a little piece of their bread and store it. Then for the next batch, they put that in there and it would leaven the whole lump. Even the women would give a piece of leaven to their daughters as a wedding present. So they would be making basically the same batch of bread as their mother throughout their whole lives, and they just kept passing it down. Okay, so that's where the expression it comes from baking bread. And a lot of us men, we may not get that, but that's where it comes from. You women might understand it. And so most of the time in the Scriptures, leaven is used to represent bad influence, mainly sin. But however, here's what we got to be careful about with symbols. We got to be careful not to attach universal meanings to symbols, or we can get in trouble with the interpretation. So we have to look at the context. So we can't say, well, leaven's always sin. Leaven is sin. Leaven is sin. Well, let's see if that's true. I'll just read Matthew 13 and 33. I'll read that parable for you. And he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It's like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leaven. Okay, if the leaven is always sin, then the kingdom of heaven will be completely saturated and overpowered by sin. And that's not the case, is it? So see, we got to be careful about that. Don't attach universal meanings to symbols. That it just has one meaning. So the context matters. You know, I remember preaching that. There are people that interpret that parable as sin. Because leaven usually represents sin in the Bible. Usually. But it cannot be the case right there. That's a positive influence in Matthew 13 and 33, not a negative. Now in verse 9 that we're looking at, it's clear to see that the leaven is used in a negative influence. And Paul used the same expression in other places as a negative influence. And I'll show you one of those in 1 Corinthians 5, starting with verse 6. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So there's Paul using the same expression in another place. But now let's look and see what he might mean with this expression here. So what he's saying is that a little bit of false teaching may seem harmless, but a little leaven leavens the whole lump of bread. And they would make big batches of bread at a time. So they were pretty big. And just a little piece would leaven that whole thing. And so what seems harmless can start small, like embers in a campfire. But then the wind picks up, and before you know it, you've got a spark. And then you've got a small flame. And then before you know it, the whole forest is on fire. And that's the way it works. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. No huge fire usually started out that way, right? It was usually a mistake, something small. Well, I thought I put the campfire out, but it didn't. And so false teaching may seem harmless, but once it starts to spread, we've got a huge problem on our hands. But it seems the prevailing attitude today is this: well, they still believe in Jesus, so we just tolerate things. Because, well, they still believe in Jesus. It's still a church. They still believe that He was crucified on the cross. They still believe in the resurrection. And see, all of those things may be true. They may believe in all that. They may even teach that. They may even preach that. But is that the right attitude to have? That's not Paul's attitude here, so what's the big deal? They still believe in Jesus. So is it a big deal? Well, we didn't have drag queen preachers overnight. That didn't just happen overnight. It all started out small, didn't it? Started out small. How did it start? My personal opinion is I think it started with allowing women to be pastors. I think that people did that on purpose. I think it was a purposeful thing to contaminate the church years ago. And so it started, I think that's where you can trace it back to. But see, you say, well, what's the big deal? Whatever. They may be gifted speakers and everything like that, but they still believe in Jesus. They still believe in Jesus. They're teaching the same thing that a man would.
So the way you're saying that, if we adopt something or say it's not that bad, take Catholicism. Well, you say they're still Christians and we take arm in arm and walk with them. We're not protecting the integrity of the Word.
Right. And that's the point.
Slippery slope.
It is. Because then what happened next, you can kind of see, my opinion is that's how homosexuality was allowed to get in the door. Because through women pastors, you get lesbian pastors. I think that's how homosexuality got into the church. That's just my personal opinion. I think you can trace the events and pretty much prove it. But then what happened, with that? Well, the churches started accepting, I'll just use homosexuality as a lifestyle. It led to that. Well, we'll accept the lifestyle. Then we'll accept members. When you accept the lifestyle, you start accepting members. And then once you start accepting members, you start accepting marriages. And then it goes on and on and on, and the leaven spreads, and now we've got men pastors, but they dress like women and claim to be women. But they still believe in Jesus. That's the attitude.
They don't believe His Word, though.
That's the attitude. So see, this is why we must defend the truth, because the evidence is all around us. A little leaven leavens the whole lump, and it can contaminate good churches. You can't tell me that some of those churches at one time were probably good churches. I ran across this quote by Mr. Spurgeon. He who does not hate the false does not love the true. He who does not hate the false does not love the true. And that's a great way to look at it. If you don't like what's bad, can you really say you like what is true? And so false teachers hinder the truth, verse 7. They're not of God, verse 8. And they contaminate the church, verse 9. However, in verse 10, we'll see a little bit different characteristic of them. They will be judged. So they're not going to get away with it. they will be judged. Verse 10.
Can I say something right there before you go on? Because when we touch on some of this, and I think it needs to be brought in here too, that is what you're talking about, the characteristics of the coming of the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a lot of... I knew I wouldn't have time. I could have gone into 2 Thessalonians and the Timothy and different things about false teachers, but I knew I wouldn't have time to go in all those places. But yes, this is not the only place you can find this in the Bible. So verse 10, he says, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. Okay, so no other view. Now what view? That's what I wrote down here. What view is he talking about? Well, we know the letter's theme is that justification is by grace and faith alone in Jesus Christ. So no other view could be a reference to the letter's overall theme. And in a broad sense, that's true. You could say that. However, in this case, I don't think that's what he's referring to. This is just me. I think he's referring to the statements that he just made in verses 8 and 9. Here's why I think that. Because let me paraphrase them and then say, and kind of paraphrase verse 10 with it. And it seems to make sense to me. This deceptive persuasion did not come from God, verse 8. And a little false teaching will eventually contaminate everything it touches, verse 9. And I'm confident in the Lord that you will have that same view and agree that their deception does not come from God, and it will spread and hinder the church. So I kind of think that's the idea that he's getting across there. In Philippians 3 and 15, he says this, Paul, let those of us who are mature think this way. And he's just talking about basic sound doctrine. Let those of us who are mature think this way. And if anything you should think otherwise, God will reveal that also to you. Only let us hold true to what we have attained. And so he says, have this view. They're not from God. They will contaminate the church. That's the way you need to think. And the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. So there will be judgment for false teachers, even though we look around and it seems like we're losing the battle, doesn't it? With false doctrine. If you just look around, it seems like we're losing big time. Well, just look at this country. If you want the evidence, just look at the White House. And so in 2 Peter chapter 2, that entire chapter is devoted to false teachers and their judgment. The book of Jude also is. And so I read a portion of this earlier, but I'll read a little bit more of it right here in 2 Peter chapter 2. He says, many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of the truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation, here's getting to the judgment part, their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. So what does that mean? Their condemnation is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Well, that just means that God has not forgotten that they will be judged. That's what he's saying. It will be on his timetable. It's not your responsibility to go out there and take them out or something like that. He has it handled. It's not idle. It's not slow. It's not slack. He will take care of it, but it's going to be on his timetable. So you don't have to worry about that. You just teach the truth. You just adhere to the truth. He will handle that part. Now let's look at the end of that sentence there. Paul has this phrase, whoever he is. Now, this might be a clue to the person's identity. It seems to come across to me that he might have been prominent, an educated person, someone that the people would have paid attention to because of his credentials. I mean, let's look at it. It depends on the tone that you read it. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So he says, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But let me read it with a different tone. The one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. See the difference? In one tone, it kind of sounds like I don't know who he is. The one troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. Or, the one troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. I think that's the way he's saying it, because it comes across that it doesn't matter your standing in the community. It doesn't matter if you're famous, if you're rich, if you're poor, if you're educated, if you're ignorant. It won't matter who they are or what your standing in society might be. You won't escape that penalty. That's kind of the tone that I see behind it like that he's saying the one who bears the penalty, whoever he is, no matter how prominent he is, or how well liked he is, or how smart he is, this kind of thing. That's the tone that I read there instead of whoever he is, like he doesn't know. It sounds like to me that it might be a clue that he's very prominent, very well liked, charismatic. False teachers are. They all are. You can't get people to follow you if you're not well liked. So, that's kind of what I read there as far as Paul's tone and the way he might be saying it. So then he goes on. He says, "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed, and I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves." Now, so another characteristic here of false teachers is that they persecute teachers of the truth. And you can see that. Just turn on with these famous people today on these Christian networks, and they will criticize doctrine. They'll criticize people like John MacArthur and these types. They'll persecute and try to put them down. Now, from Paul's question at the beginning there of verse 11, it looks like somebody was claiming that he was preaching circumcision or keeping of the law, because he states that if I was doing that, why is he still being persecuted by these people that say that I am? It doesn't make any sense to preach law keeping and then be persecuted by the people who believe in the law keeping. That doesn't really make any sense. And he obviously did not preach that. He said in chapter 2, verse 21, "I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose." And so somebody must have been lying about him right here, trying to, make him appear like he was an apostle and just flat out telling lies about that he really does preach this, and trying to lead people astray. That appears to be the case, and why he would ask that question. But then the second half of that verse, the offense of the cross has been removed. In that case, so if I were doing that, in that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. Now, I've only got a few notes on this comment, about this much of my page here, that you can't see. But I probably stared at my computer screen for a total, over an hour. Just throughout the week, not at one time, but just throughout the week on this one particular phrase. Because, I try to choose my words carefully and simplistically so you can understand what it might mean. And I just had nothing. I just had nothing as how I was going to word it to put, across to you as I was staring at that. And so I went to this. The offense of the cross has been removed. So I'm going to use Stephen as an example. So when Stephen was stoned, what was he charged with? Was it worshiping Jesus? Was he charged with that? Was he charged with being a believer in Jesus? And the answer to those questions is no. He wasn't charged about believing in Jesus or worshiping Jesus. He was charged with speaking against the holy place and the law of Moses. And you see that in Acts 6, starting with verse 11. "Then they secretly instigated men who said, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.' And they set up false witnesses who said, 'This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us.'" So he was charged with speaking against Moses and the temple system. Really, it didn't have that much to do with Jesus. That was just a side note to them. And see, that's the point here with Paul. If Paul was admitting that observance of the law was necessary for salvation, then the offense of the cross was gone, because the Judaizers cared more about Paul opposing circumcision than the fact that he was preaching Christ. And so they would be okay with Christ as long as observance of the law was added to it. That was the most important issue And I think that's the point here. If Paul would just add the law to Christ, then the offense is gone. And there would be no conflict between the two groups. And that seems to be the point that he's making here. If I would just have added circumcision to Christ, they'd be okay. And we would not be at odds, because that was the most important issue, was him opposing the circumcision, not so much just preaching Christ. And so, in verse 12, we think we'll have time to get this in. We see a pretty harsh statement here, don't we? One of the harshest that you might find of Paul's in his writings. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Now that's pretty strong, okay? So what's the key word in the verse? And that's not a trick question. It's obviously emasculate, right? Now from the Greek, here's what it means. It means to cut off, especially a member of the body. So it means basically to mutilate yourself or to amputate yourself. And the word was apparently often used to refer to castration. Is the main context of the word. Now this is difficult to decipher. Is Paul speaking figuratively here or literally? You know, most of the time you can tell when you have figurative language and when you don't. A little leaven leavens the whole lump is out. I mean, that's obvious. He's not talking about bread, right? So that's easy. But is this literal or figurative? I don't know. So I'll just give you both scenarios, both interpretations, okay? If it's figurative, this is what he might mean. If it's in a figurative way, he's saying that he wishes that these people would just cut themselves off from the church, amputate themselves from the church, and stop spreading their lies. Or maybe that God would remove them from the church and judge them, maybe possibly even with death. Because that would be better than having them being dead would be better than them deceiving masses of people and being led away from the truth. So that could be a possible meaning figuratively. But I think there's a good possibility he might mean this literally. I think there's a good possibility that he means literally castrate themselves. Because the point would be, if circumcision makes you acceptable to God, why stop there? Why stop with circumcision? Why not just castrate yourself as the ultimate religious devotion like some of the pagans did? Why not just go as far as they do? If the circumcision makes you holy, don't stop there. Because pagans would go even farther. Or further, I should say. So why don't you just go that far? So he could be saying that. And so I don't really know which one that he might actually mean, that they just cut themselves off from the church, or that they literally should take it that far with their religious devotion. So I guess you can just take the better interpretation. It doesn't change the context either way. We still have the same meaning. It doesn't really change anything. But that's a pretty strong statement. And that's a strong verb too. And so I tend to lean toward, I think it's literal. I think he literally means that. Because that's a strong word choice. But I guess in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter which way he means it. He's not happy about false teachers being there. So let's close this out. So the correct characteristics here that we can see of these false teachers in 7 to 12, they hinder the truth. That was in verse 7. They're not of God. Verse 8. They contaminate the church. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Verse 10, they will be judged. They're not going to get away with it. And they persecute teachers of truth. And so beginning in verse 13, we won't cover this today, but once we start in verse 13, let me just put that up on the screen right quick, just so we can look at it. Beginning there, Paul's going to remind us that we're not called to this type of bondage again, and that but we're called to freedom. But we're going to see that he gives us a warning about our freedom that we'll discuss next time. We haven't really seen that yet. He's reiterated the point over and over and over again throughout, especially from 3, 4, and what we've done in 5, that we're not called to slavery and bondage, but we're called to freedom. But here, he's going to give us a warning about our freedom. And so we'll have to look at that the next time that we come to this. I won't be with you in Sunday school next week. Next week, I'll be preaching, so we'll finish up that parable of the conversation Jesus was having with the Pharisees there, that third parable of that trilogy. That's what we'll look at. So it'll be a few weeks before we pick back up here. So important. Let's just tie this right quick. That last statement. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Let's go back to that Spurgeon quote. He who does not hate the false does not love the true. I think that verse there is a pretty good example of hating the false. And we'll leave it at that.